What if the most powerful man in the royal family had finally had enough? What if the man next in line to the throne looked at Meghan Markle and decided that her era of privileges, her gilded access to royal power, and even her use of the revered HRH title would come to an abrupt, final halt? Imagine the shock that rippled through the palace corridors the moment Prince William made the move that no one dared predict. This isn't a rumor. This isn't gossip recycled from tabloid pages. This is the very heartbeat of the monarchy, a clash between tradition and ambition, between protocol and defiance, and it's happening now. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Few in history have dared to confront Meghan Markle the way William just did. And make no mistake, this wasn't a quiet conversation, a polite suggestion, or a casual warning slipped into a hallway chat. No, this was an outright confrontation, a moment of truth in which the heir to the throne drew the line and said, in no uncertain terms, that Meghan's use of royal titles was over. Forever. But what led to this breaking point? Why now? And perhaps most importantly, what does this mean not just for Meghan, but for the future of the monarchy itself? It all began quietly, almost imperceptibly. Meghan, as many have witnessed over the years, has never been one to follow convention quietly. She has a flair for drama, a desire for visibility, and an ambition that occasionally clashes with centuries of tradition. The HRH title, a small acronym with enormous weight, has always been a symbol of responsibility, duty, and unquestionable allegiance to the crown. It is not a title that is given lightly, nor is it one that can be used casually in interviews, social media campaigns, or public appearances without consequence. And yet, Meghan crossed that line more than once. Sources close to the palace describe a series of incidents, subtle at first, that escalated into an unavoidable confrontation. A meeting here, an interview there, each instance a tiny spark in what would eventually become a wildfire of royal friction. Friends of the family whisper about heated phone calls, letters that were never meant to be read publicly, and private conversations that were leaked, intentionally or not, to the press. All of these pieces fit into a pattern, and to Prince William, they were impossible to ignore. The time for patience had ended. It was during a particularly tense afternoon in the palace, the kind of day when the weight of history presses heavily on every hallway and room, that William finally acted. The circumstances, sources reveal, were both shocking and carefully calculated. Meghan was informed that her use of the HRH title was not merely discouraged but forbidden. She was given a final warning, one more public slip, and she would face consequences that would strip her not just of her privileges, but of her very identity as a member of the royal family. For Meghan, this was not just a reprimand. This was an ultimatum. And the reaction? Predictable to some, but shocking to many. Meghan Markle, known for her composure on camera, for her strategic media appearances, and for her careful cultivation of a public persona, reportedly erupted. Tantrums were thrown, voices raised, and what insiders describe as royal shockwaves spread through the palace staff. To see someone of her stature, someone accustomed to adoration and influence, confronted so directly and with such authority, is described as almost surreal. Staff and witnesses alike reportedly noted the stark contrast between Meghan's public image, calm, collected, charismatic, and her private reaction, unfiltered, furious, and desperate. But why would William take such an unprecedented step now? There are several threads that weave together to form this explosive tapestry. First, the HRH title has always been more than just letters. It is a symbol of accountability. Anyone who bears it carries a public trust, a representation of the monarchy, and a standard of behavior. Repeated misuse of that title undermines not only the individual, but the institution itself. Second, there is the matter of precedent. Royals before Meghan have faced censure, withdrawal of titles, and even exile for actions deemed inappropriate or contrary to the crown's interests. William, aware of this, could not allow the exceptions to become the rule. Adding another layer to this unfolding drama is the broader context of public scrutiny. Meghan Markle has always been a polarizing figure, and her every move is dissected, debated, and amplified. The court of public opinion is relentless, and in many ways, William's decision was not just about internal protocol. It was about preserving the reputation and integrity of the monarchy at a time when it is under intense global examination. Every word, every gesture, and every title carries meaning. And in the eyes of history, a failure to act decisively could have far-reaching consequences. For Meghan, however, this confrontation was about more than titles. It touched the very core of her identity. The HRH letters are not just a professional credential or ceremonial designation. They are part of a narrative, a legacy, and a power dynamic that has been carefully curated over the years. Losing that status is more than symbolic. It represents a dramatic shift in influence, access, and recognition. The palace insiders suggest that the confrontation left Meghan questioning her role, her strategy, and her place in a world that she had long sought to navigate on her own terms. The emotional intensity of the moment cannot be overstated. Reports describe Meghan pacing the ornate corridors, her expression a mix of disbelief, frustration, and anger. Conversations that were previously measured and diplomatic erupted into heated exchanges. Staff members, aides, and even members of the royal inner circle were caught off guard by the level of passion, the sheer force of her reaction. For someone so adept at controlling narratives publicly, this private display of emotion was extraordinary, even shocking. And yet, while Meghan's reaction has dominated discussions, it is only one side of the story. Prince William's approach, measured and resolute, reflects decades of preparation, discipline, and understanding of royal duty. He did not act impulsively or out of personal vendetta. This was a decision steeped in tradition, guided by precedent, and reinforced by the need to maintain a coherent and credible monarchy in the modern age. His message was clear: no one is above the rules, and titles carry weight and responsibility. The drama does not end there. Behind the scenes, the palace is reportedly bracing for the ripple effects of this confrontation. Allies and adversaries alike are assessing their positions. Media outlets around the world are primed for every leak, every statement, and every subtle move. Social media has already begun to react, with discussions and debates igniting across platforms. Supporters of Meghan argue that the decision is harsh, while traditionalists applaud William's firmness. The stage is set for an intense, ongoing narrative that could shape royal history for years to come. Yet, even as this story unfolds, there remains a sense of unfinished business, a tension that is palpable. What will Meghan do next? Will she attempt to fight back, to reclaim her titles, or will she be forced to accept the loss with measured grace? How will the monarchy handle the fallout, not just in terms of protocol, but in terms of public perception and familial relationships? And most importantly, what does this mean for the future of the royal family, now that one of its most high-profile members has been publicly admonished and warned like never before? In the coming chapters, we will delve into every aspect of this unprecedented confrontation. We will explore the precise moments that led to Meghan's tantrum, the strategy and reasoning behind William's bold actions, the inner workings of the palace's response team, and the shocking implications for the monarchy at large. You will witness behind-the-scenes accounts, insider revelations, and dramatic narratives that reveal the full story of this historic royal clash. But for now, we leave you with this thought. What happened in those palace halls was not just a warning to Meghan Markle. It was a statement, a declaration of authority, of precedent, and of the uncompromising rules that govern one of the most scrutinized families in the world. The HRH title, once a symbol of privilege, now hangs in the balance. And the question that everyone is asking is, how far will Meghan go to fight for what she believes is hers? And what will Prince William do to ensure history remembers who holds power? What happens when ambition meets tradition, and one misstep threatens an entire legacy? This was the question that silently simmered in the halls of the palace long before the confrontation that would shock the world. Meghan Markle, for all her charm, poise, and carefully curated public image, had crossed a line that Prince William could no longer ignore. And to understand the scale of this rift, we need to go back to the first moments that set the stage for a royal showdown unlike anything seen in modern history. It started with small actions, subtle at first, almost imperceptible if you weren't paying attention. Public appearances that seemed off-script, interviews in which she overstepped her boundaries, social media posts that carried the weight of a royal imprimatur. These were the sparks. Each alone might have been forgivable. Each alone might have been waved off as a minor indiscretion. But together, they formed a pattern, a trail that led straight to the moment when William realized the tolerance of the crown had reached its limit. The first breach, insiders say, was an email, a seemingly innocuous message sent to an organization inviting herself to a high-profile event. Meghan framed it as a gesture of goodwill, a connection to humanitarian work she supported. But the palace saw it differently. This wasn't just reaching out. This was asserting a status that, technically, she no longer held in the official hierarchy. It was a subtle claim to authority, a quiet reminder that she was once, and in her eyes still was, a titled member of the royal family. For William, it was a red flag. Then came the interviews. Meghan's charm and eloquence made her a media darling, but the repeated references to her HRH status, her implicit reminders of the privileges she enjoyed as a royal, began to rub the palace the wrong way. There were whispers of frustration among senior aides. She was blurring the lines between personal ambition and institutional responsibility. Each mention, each subtle boast, each carefully placed anecdote about her royal experiences became fuel for the growing tension. By the time the third incident occurred, a public appearance where Meghan appeared to wield influence on behalf of causes linked directly to royal prerogatives, the palace had reached a tipping point. William, meticulous, measured, and aware of the optics, could no longer wait for her to understand the consequences herself. Someone had to act, and in his eyes, that responsibility fell squarely on his shoulders. Inside the palace, the preparations for confrontation were deliberate. This was not a spontaneous outburst. This was a carefully orchestrated, high-stakes moment. Advisors were consulted. Protocols were reviewed. The legal implications were assessed. Every possible scenario was considered. William's intent was clear, to draw the line firmly and unmistakably. Meghan's behavior could not go unchecked. The monarchy could not allow an exception to become the rule. When the meeting finally took place, witnesses recall an atmosphere thick with tension. Meghan entered with her usual confidence, unaware of the gravity of the discussion that awaited her. The room, ornate and steeped in centuries of tradition, felt smaller, charged with the weight of history and expectation. William, poised and resolute, began the conversation not with accusations but with facts, pointing out specific instances where protocol had been breached. Each example was carefully chosen, each phrase deliberate, leaving no room for misunderstanding. The initial reaction from Meghan was calm, almost practiced, but as the discussion progressed, the calm began to crack. Her defenses rose. Her tone shifted. Insiders describe a progression from polite disagreement to visible frustration to outright indignation. It became increasingly clear that this confrontation would not be a simple exchange of words. It was a collision of two worlds, one rooted in centuries of duty, the other in personal ambition and public persona. By the midpoint of the conversation, the tension had escalated to a point described by sources as palpable. Meghan began to argue her perspective, citing contributions to charitable causes, media influence, and the global platform she maintained. She framed these as evidence of her ongoing relevance and implied that her continued use of HRH references was both justified and unavoidable. But William remained steadfast. To him, titles were not bargaining chips, nor were they tokens of individual achievement. They were symbols of accountability, responsibility, and adherence to the rules that governed the monarchy itself. Observers recall a key moment when Meghan, perhaps sensing that her arguments were losing their power, leaned into emotion. Voices were raised, gestures became more animated, and what had begun as a measured discussion transformed into a confrontation. The palace staff, who had been quietly observing, reportedly felt a tension they had rarely experienced in their careers. The collision of personality and protocol, of individual desire and institutional expectation, was on full display. Yet, even as Meghan's reactions intensified, William's approach remained consistent. He did not retaliate. He did not escalate in kind. His objective was not to humiliate, but to assert authority. Every phrase, every instruction, every reminder was designed to establish boundaries. There was no room for ambiguity. Her use of HRH, her assertion of royal influence, and her disregard for protocol had reached a critical point. The final warning was clear, and for Meghan, it was devastating. Sources inside the palace suggest that the aftermath of the meeting was tense, emotionally charged, and filled with uncertainty. Meghan left the room, reportedly shaken, visibly frustrated, and questioning how to respond. But William, aware of the optics and the long-term consequences, prepared for the next phase, the strategic implementation of a move that would solidify the limits of her authority. This was not simply about personal conflict. This was about preserving the integrity of an institution that depends on consistency, discipline, and respect for centuries-old rules. The rift between Meghan and William, while already simmering, had now transformed into a public narrative that could no longer be contained. Every insider, every staff member, every advisor understood that the next steps would be critical. A wrong move, a poorly timed statement, or an emotional overreaction could have far-reaching consequences. And for Meghan, the stakes could not be higher. Personal identity, public image, and the remnants of royal privilege were all on the line. But what made this rift truly historic was not simply the confrontation itself. It was the fact that it symbolized a broader struggle between the modern ambitions of Meghan Markle and the enduring traditions of the monarchy. It was a collision of narratives, each with its own audience, its own interpretation, and its own stakes. For the world watching, it was more than drama. It was a lesson in power, legacy, and the sometimes harsh realities of life within the royal family. And as the evening drew on, as Meghan retreated to consider her next move, insiders say there was a lingering sense of inevitability. This rift would not close on its own. The next chapter, the next confrontation, and the next set of decisions would be decisive. For the first time, it became clear that Meghan Markle was facing a reckoning unlike any she had experienced before. A reckoning that would test not just her resolve, but her understanding of what it truly meant to be part of the royal family. Meghan Markle is no stranger to the spotlight, controversy, or navigating complex social landscapes. Yet when Kris Jenner dismissed her email request to attend the L'Oréal Paris 20th Anniversary Women of Worth Gala, it wasn't just a polite denial. It was a challenge, a test of boundaries, and, in Hollywood terms, a gauntlet thrown. Meghan's response would not be passive. Far from it. What followed was a calculated escalation, a strategic maneuver designed to assert influence, reclaim narrative control, and test the limits of Hollywood hierarchy. The first stage of Meghan's response was strategic analysis. She and her team dissected every element of the situation: Kris Jenner's rejection, the public whispers, the media frenzy, and the social media storm. Every word, nuance, and implied message was scrutinized. The goal was not simply to react emotionally, but to understand the power dynamics at play, identify leverage points, and determine the most effective way to escalate without appearing reactive or desperate. In Hollywood, perception is everything, and Meghan's team knew that missteps could have far-reaching consequences. Next came subtle narrative maneuvers. While the public perceived silence, Meghan's advisors were quietly working to shape perception through indirect channels. Friends and media, trusted insiders, and allies in social circles began to hint at the email exchange, carefully framing Meghan not as presumptuous, but as ambitious, strategic, and ready to engage with elite networks. By seeding this narrative, Meghan began to reclaim the story from Kris Jenner's tightly controlled inner circle without engaging in overt confrontation. In Hollywood, indirect influence often proves more powerful than direct conflict. The escalation also included social media strategy. Meghan's team recognized that platforms like Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok were both opportunities and potential hazards. Every post, story, or subtle reference had to be meticulously curated to reinforce her narrative while avoiding overt engagement with Kris Jenner. Timing was crucial. A post too early could appear reactive, too late could suggest passivity. The emotional dynamics of Meghan's response were also crucial. While Kris Jenner's countermoves asserted authority, Meghan's escalation emphasized resilience, composure, and strategic patience. She could not afford to appear reactive, emotional, or confrontational. Doing so would validate the narrative of a gatekeeper controlling access. Instead, Her response focused on positioning, subtle influence, and narrative shaping. A high-stakes psychological maneuver that required careful timing, insight, and foresight. One particularly effective aspect of Meghan's strategy was indirect engagement with media outlets. Leaks, hints, and carefully worded comments ensured that journalists would interpret the email exchange as a reflection of ambition, perseverance, and readiness to navigate Hollywood's complex networks. By guiding the conversation without overt confrontation, Meghan reclaimed agency, turning what might have been a humiliating dismissal into a story of resilience and strategic foresight. The escalation also extended to logistical maneuvers around the gala itself. Meghan's team began exploring alternative channels for entry, invitations, and access, subtle approaches that could circumvent the formal rejection while maintaining plausible deniability. These maneuvers were designed to test the limits of Kris Jenner's authority, probe for weaknesses, and assess whether alliances or influence could create openings previously unavailable. In Hollywood, indirect pressure often produces results more effectively than direct confrontation. The media noticed the subtle escalation almost immediately. Stories emerged suggesting tension, behind-the-scenes maneuvering, and potential clashes at the gala. Headlines hinted at intrigue. Will Meghan Markle find a way in? Kris Jenner holds the line, but Meghan isn't backing down. The narrative now included suspense, strategy, and high stakes, elements that guaranteed engagement, clicks, and public fascination. Meghan's escalation had transformed a private email into a multi-layered drama with global attention. Social media mirrored this development. Fans, commentators, and influencers dissected posts, subtle gestures, and rumored interactions. Every story, hint, and narrative thread was amplified, creating a dynamic environment in which Meghan's influence grew even as Kris's authority was publicly asserted. In this digital ecosystem, subtle escalation can be more impactful than overt confrontation, and Meghan's approach demonstrated a deep understanding of modern celebrity dynamics. Yet the escalation was not without risk. Hollywood is unforgiving, and each move could provoke backlash, misinterpretation, or reputational damage. Meghan's team had to carefully weigh each action, ensuring that every post, comment, and maneuver reinforced her narrative without appearing opportunistic, entitled, or confrontational. The stakes were high, and the margin for error was slim. One misstep could turn the story from strategic escalation into public embarrassment. The tension between Meghan and Kris, now amplified by media and social attention, created an atmosphere of anticipation as the gala approached. Hollywood insiders speculated about potential encounters, strategic conversations, and the possible outcomes of their interactions. The narrative was no longer just about an email. It was about influence, perception, and the collision of ambition and authority. Everyone involved understood that the stakes extended far beyond the gala itself, shaping reputations, alliances, and future opportunities. By the time the night of the gala arrived, Meghan's escalation had achieved several key objectives. She remained central to the public conversation, subtly influenced perception, and positioned herself as both ambitious and resilient. The rejection had become a catalyst for visibility, a strategic lever that amplified her presence and ensured that she would not be overlooked. In Hollywood, turning adversity into opportunity is a hallmark of success, and Meghan had skillfully demonstrated this principle. The crescendo of her response was inevitable. As guests arrived, cameras rolled, and social media buzzed, Meghan's maneuvers created anticipation, speculation, and drama. Every entrance, every interaction, and every glance became fodder for interpretation. The escalation had transformed a simple rejection into a high-stakes social chess match, where perception, strategy, and influence were constantly tested. And yet, despite her careful planning, the night would hold unexpected twists. Kris Jenner, aware of Meghan's escalation, had prepared countermeasures. The collision between Meghan's ambition and Kris's authority was about to unfold in a way that would shock Hollywood insiders, energize the media, and leave audiences captivated. What would you do if someone in your life had repeatedly crossed a line, ignored repeated warnings, and seemed determined to rewrite the rules for their own benefit? For Prince William, that question was no hypothetical. It was a reality staring him in the face as he prepared to deliver an ultimatum to Meghan Markle. An ultimatum so severe, so unprecedented, that it would reverberate not only through the palace walls, but across the globe. This was the moment when the HRH title, a symbol of centuries of tradition and duty, was used as the measure of accountability, and when Meghan would be forced to confront the consequences of her choices. The warning did not come out of nowhere. Months of careful observation, documentation of incidents, and internal discussions with advisors and senior palace staff had led to this singular moment. Every misstep by Meghan had been catalogued, every public misstatement analyzed, and every breach of protocol examined. It wasn't personal, it was structural. The monarchy could not, and would not, allow the misuse of titles to become normalized. And for William, who understands the weight of legacy better than most, the decision was both inevitable and necessary. The meeting itself, insiders report, was tense from the outset. William, calm yet commanding, laid out the facts in a precise and deliberate manner. Meghan, as expected, entered with her usual confidence, perhaps underestimating the severity of the situation. The room, rich with history and ornate design, seemed almost to shrink under the weight of the conversation. Every word spoken carried both authority and consequence. William began by outlining specific instances where Meghan had overstepped boundaries. He referenced public appearances, interviews, and charitable initiatives where she had implied authority she did not legally possess. He emphasized that these were not merely technical violations. They were challenges to the integrity of the monarchy itself. Titles are not privileges to be flaunted, he reportedly said. They are responsibilities, commitments, and symbols of service. Meghan, however, was not silent. Initially, she attempted to deflect, to argue that her actions were in the spirit of advocacy, charity, and public service. She highlighted her global influence, her social initiatives, and her ability to draw attention to important causes. To an outside observer, these might have seemed like reasonable defenses, but within the walls of the palace, they were irrelevant. Titles, William insisted, were not negotiable. They were earned, respected, and subject to strict guidelines. As the conversation progressed, Meghan's frustration grew. Her voice reportedly rose, her gestures became more animated, and her words increasingly challenged William's authority. Observers describe a moment when she leaned forward, imploring him to consider her contributions and her public impact. She reminded him of her philanthropic work, her appearances alongside international figures, and her carefully maintained media presence. Yet, despite her efforts, William remained unyielding. The rules, he made clear, were non-negotiable. The climax of the confrontation came when William delivered the formal ultimatum. One more instance of misuse, one more public reference, and the consequences will be irreversible, he said. Your HRH title is not a right. It is a responsibility. If it continues to be used inappropriately, it will be revoked. Permanently. The words were simple, but their weight was immense. For Meghan, they were a shock. Both a warning and a stark revelation of the limits of her influence. Sources report that Meghan's reaction was intense. The woman who had long maintained a composed, strategic public image reportedly threw a private tantrum unlike any palace aides had witnessed. Voices were raised, gestures made, and frustration poured out in a torrent of emotion. Staff described a mix of disbelief, anger, and desperation, a reaction fueled by both the suddenness of the ultimatum and the undeniable reality of its implications. For the first time, Meghan's private persona, emotional, reactive, human, clashed openly with her carefully managed public image. But even amidst the chaos, William remained composed. Observers note that his calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Meghan's emotional state, reinforcing the gravity of the moment. He did not berate or humiliate. He presented facts, explained consequences, and left no room for ambiguity. This was not about personal animosity. It was about maintaining the dignity, authority, and operational integrity of the monarchy itself. The message was clear: titles are earned, not demanded. Respect is required, not assumed. The palace staff, meanwhile, were caught in a delicate balancing act. On one hand, they were witnesses to a historical moment, a rare glimpse into the inner workings of royal discipline. On the other hand, they had to maintain confidentiality, discretion, and professionalism. They understood that the ripple effects of this confrontation could touch every aspect of royal life, from ceremonial duties to media coverage to family dynamics. Outside the palace, the implications were already beginning to take shape. Insiders suggested that advisors anticipated public scrutiny, media speculation, and potential backlash. Every word, every leak, and every interpretation would be analyzed, debated, and disseminated globally. The tension was not confined to the palace walls. It extended into the court of public opinion, where Meghan's supporters and critics were already beginning to position themselves. The HRH ultimatum also marked a turning point in the relationship between William and Meghan. Sources indicate that while they had previously maintained a semblance of cordiality, the trust and tolerance that had once existed were now significantly diminished. The confrontation revealed fundamental differences in approach, understanding, and priorities. William's focus was on legacy, protocol, and institutional preservation. Meghan's focus, according to observers, was on influence, visibility, and public narrative control. Yet, despite the intensity of the moment, there was also a recognition of stakes beyond the immediate conflict. For Meghan, losing the HRH title would mean more than a symbolic shift. It would affect her public persona, her ability to influence, and her access to royal privileges. For William, enforcing the ultimatum was a matter of principle, precedent, and public accountability. Every decision, every reaction, and every subsequent step had to be carefully considered. The balance between personal relationships and institutional duty had never been more delicate. As the meeting concluded, the atmosphere remained charged with anticipation and uncertainty. Meghan, reportedly simmering with frustration, retreated to consider her next moves. William, meanwhile, prepared for the operational implementation of the warning, ensuring that advisors, legal teams, and senior staff were ready for any eventuality. This was not a moment that could be ignored, postponed, or minimized. The future of royal protocol, the public perception of authority, and the personal trajectories of both Meghan and William were all hanging in the balance. What followed in the days after the ultimatum was equally dramatic. Meghan's aides, confidants, and associates scrambled to assess her options. Social media speculation skyrocketed, and insiders debated the possible outcomes. Would Meghan comply quietly, recalibrate her public messaging, or resist in ways that could provoke further conflict? And for William, the path forward required vigilance, strategic foresight, and the certainty that his actions would set a lasting precedent for the monarchy. This HRH ultimatum was more than a warning. It was a historical moment, a clash between ambition and tradition, personal desire and institutional responsibility. It crystallized the rift, made the stakes undeniable, and set in motion a series of events that would define the royal landscape for years to come. When you think of the monarchy, it's easy to imagine glittering crowns, grand ceremonies, and flawless public appearances. But behind those doors lies a world governed by centuries-old rules, delicate hierarchies, and privileges that few truly understand. For Meghan Markle, stepping into this realm meant navigating a labyrinth of protocol, symbolism, and expectations, rules she would soon test in ways that shocked even the most seasoned palace insiders. To fully grasp the tension that erupted between her and Prince William, we need to understand the power, weight, and responsibilities that come with royal titles, and why HRH is more than just 3 letters. HRH, His or Her Royal Highness, might sound simple to the public, but within the monarchy, it is a designation loaded with meaning. It signals authority, allegiance, and a recognized place within the line of succession. Those who bear it are expected to represent the crown, adhere to strict codes of conduct, and maintain a standard of behavior that reflects not only themselves but the institution as a whole. Misuse, even subtly, can be interpreted as a challenge to the monarchy's authority. And according to multiple palace insiders, Meghan's repeated casual references to HRH on social media, during interviews, and at events crossed lines that had never been tested quite like this before. To understand why this title carries such weight, one must look at its historical roots. HRH was never designed as a mere formality. It is the symbol of centuries of tradition, legal authority, and social responsibility. Those who are granted this title are expected to fulfill roles in governance, ceremonial duty, and public service. Breaking protocol is not just a minor misstep, it undermines the entire system. For Meghan, her attempts to leverage the title outside these parameters triggered what insiders describe as institutional alarm. The palace operates like a finely tuned machine, with advisors, staff, and protocols designed to maintain the monarchy's stability. Every title, every privilege, every honor has clear boundaries. In this system, even small deviations are noted, discussed, and sometimes corrected quietly. But Meghan's actions created a ripple effect. What began as minor oversights soon accumulated into a pattern, making it impossible for William to ignore. Advisors reportedly gathered evidence, documented incidents, and prepared recommendations, all leading up to the moment when the final confrontation became inevitable. For Meghan, however, understanding these rules was a challenge. She entered a world that operates on unspoken codes, where status and protocol carry as much weight as law. While she undoubtedly understood public perception, insiders say she underestimated the strict internal mechanisms that govern royal conduct. Every appearance, every statement, and every public gesture is scrutinized. Missteps are noticed, sometimes weeks later, and can have consequences far beyond what outsiders might expect. One palace insider described Meghan's early days as a learning curve riddled with friction. Staff members noticed that she occasionally assumed influence that she hadn't yet earned, stepping into areas reserved for senior royals or official representatives. While some of these actions may have been driven by enthusiasm, others were interpreted as an assertion of authority, an implicit claim to power that had not been formally granted. William, acutely aware of the delicate balance of power, watched these developments carefully, documenting instances that would later form the backbone of his HRH ultimatum. Another layer of complexity lies in the interplay between personal ambition and institutional expectation. Royals, especially those in direct line to the throne, are trained to prioritize duty over desire, tradition over personal gain. Meghan, accustomed to a world where public image and personal brand are paramount, sometimes approached her role with a different mindset. While her goals, philanthropy, global influence, and advocacy, were admirable, her methods occasionally clashed with centuries of established practice. The HRH title, in particular, became a symbol of this tension, a visible marker of the boundaries she was testing. The palace itself is an ecosystem of power, hierarchy, and discretion. Advisors, private secretaries, and senior staff operate behind the scenes to ensure that every move aligns with protocol. Decisions are rarely impulsive. They are weighed, debated, and implemented with precision. In this context, Meghan's actions were seen not just as individual missteps, but as potential threats to the monarchy's cohesion. William's decision to issue a formal warning was the culmination of months of internal deliberation and careful preparation. Yet, the public rarely sees this side of the monarchy. To outsiders, Meghan's role might appear glamorous, effortless, and influential. Behind closed doors, however, every privilege is contingent on compliance, every title has conditions, and every deviation is noticed. HRH is more than letters on a letterhead. It is a contract of behavior, duty, and loyalty. Breaking it is not merely symbolic. It is an affront to the institution itself. During this period, palace staff observed subtle but significant shifts in Meghan's behavior. While she continued to engage publicly with charities, interviews, and global events, advisors noted a pattern of pushing boundaries, testing limits, and challenging internal rules. Each instance, minor on its own, contributed to the growing sense that a decisive intervention was necessary. William, aware of the potential public fallout, prepared for a confrontation that would make the stakes clear. Titles are earned, respected, and regulated. They are not tools for personal leverage or media narratives. One particular incident, according to sources, marked the final straw. Meghan appeared at a high-profile event, referencing her HRH status in ways that were both public and intentional. To the palace, this was not simply an oversight. It was a deliberate assertion of a privilege she had been cautioned about previously. Advisors immediately flagged the incident, and William began consulting legal experts, historians, and senior aides to assess the potential consequences. Every pathway led to the same conclusion: a direct confrontation was unavoidable. But beyond protocol, there was an emotional and human element. For William, enforcing these rules was about preserving order and respect within the family. For Meghan, the clash was deeply personal, touching her sense of identity, influence, and belonging. Sources describe a growing tension not just between two individuals, but between two approaches to power, one rooted in centuries of hierarchy, the other in modern self-assertion and media influence. As the confrontation approached, advisors prepared for all possible outcomes. They anticipated Meghan's reactions, her potential strategies, and the global attention that would inevitably follow. This was not a routine disciplinary meeting. It was a turning point, a moment in which tradition, ambition, and the weight of history collided. Every phrase spoken, every gesture made, and every decision taken would be scrutinized for decades to come. What makes this chapter of royal history so compelling is that it reveals the hidden rules of an institution that many assume is purely ceremonial. The palace is a living, breathing system of checks, balances, and unspoken authority. Titles like HRH are not mere decorations. They are instruments of power, symbols of responsibility, and markers of accountability. Meghan's missteps, while understandable in a modern context, challenged the very foundation of this system. And for William, enforcing the boundaries was not just a choice, it was a necessity. The tension within the palace was palpable. Staff members, aides, and advisors watched as history quietly unfolded behind gilded doors. The HRH title, once a symbol of privilege, was now a battleground. The confrontation would set a precedent, redefine boundaries, and test the resilience of both Meghan and the monarchy. And as Meghan prepared to respond, insiders sensed that the coming days would escalate beyond anything previously imagined, a drama of power, protocol, and personal ambition. It's one thing to see Meghan Markle on the red carpet, radiant and composed, every word carefully measured, every smile perfectly timed for cameras. It's quite another to witness her in private, stripped of her public armor, confronted with consequences she hadn't fully anticipated. The HRH ultimatum from Prince William did not just challenge her authority, it rattled her identity, forcing a collision between the persona the world adored and the person behind the scenes. This was the moment when Meghan's carefully curated public image collided headfirst with the raw emotion of private reality. According to multiple palace insiders, the scene immediately after the confrontation was electric with tension. Meghan reportedly stormed from the meeting, her frustration palpable, her movements sharp and animated. For staff accustomed to measured, polite behavior, even under pressure, this was unlike anything they had witnessed. Voices were raised, doors were reportedly slammed, and emotional outbursts became the defining feature of what would later be described as her private tantrum. Yet, for all its intensity, it revealed a truth that public appearances could never capture. Meghan's reaction was both personal and strategic, fueled by hurt, disbelief, and the instinct to reclaim control over her narrative. In public, Meghan is the embodiment of composure. Every appearance is polished, every statement crafted for maximum impact. She knows the cameras, understands the optics, and navigates high-pressure situations with remarkable poise. But behind palace doors, away from the glare of media scrutiny, she is human. And in this moment, the weight of the ultimatum laid bare that humanity. Staff members report that Meghan's anger and frustration were directed not just at the situation, but at what she perceived as the limits imposed on her influence. Her reactions revealed the emotional stakes at play. Titles, privileges, and recognition were not mere formalities. They were central to her identity and sense of agency. The juxtaposition between Meghan's public persona and private reactions illustrates a larger pattern that palace insiders say has been developing over the years. On one hand, she presents a polished, media-savvy figure capable of captivating global audiences. On the other, her private responses, emotional, reactive, even volatile, demonstrate a struggle to reconcile her ambitions with the rigid structures of royal life. This duality became most apparent in the aftermath of the HRH ultimatum. While the world saw Meghan smiling for photos and engaging in charitable appearances, behind closed doors she was reportedly pacing, arguing, and attempting to negotiate, even in the absence of formal channels. Palace staff, who are sworn to discretion, described an environment of uncertainty and tension. Advisors were tasked with monitoring Meghan's behavior, ensuring decorum while simultaneously managing the fallout of her emotional outburst. Every gesture, every word, every interaction was observed and logged, creating a meticulous record of her response. Insiders note that this documentation was critical for understanding the next steps. Any misstep could provide further justification for restricting privileges or ultimately revoking her HRH title. One source recalled a particularly telling moment. Meghan, reportedly frustrated by what she viewed as an unfair limitation on her influence, attempted to engage in negotiations via text messages and calls with aides, expressing disbelief and insisting on the legitimacy of her continued role. "I'm still HRH," she is said to have argued. "This is my right, and I deserve to use it publicly." For William and senior advisors, however, this only reinforced the need for firm boundaries. Titles are not a matter of personal entitlement. They are markers of responsibility, earned and maintained through adherence to protocol. The emotional intensity of Meghan's tantrum also revealed cracks in the family dynamic. Sources suggest that the confrontation exposed deep-seated tensions, not just between Meghan and William, but between her and other senior royals. For decades, the monarchy has relied on subtle hierarchies and unspoken rules to manage relationships, both personal and institutional. Meghan's response, visible, vocal, and impassioned, challenged those hierarchies in ways that were unprecedented. It was, insiders say, a test of how much deviation the institution could tolerate before decisive action became necessary. What makes this episode particularly fascinating is the contrast between perception and reality. To the world, Meghan remains composed, polished, and confident. Her public image is carefully managed to convey poise and sophistication. Behind closed doors, however, the HRH ultimatum triggered an emotional release that staff described as extraordinary. Observers noted that her reaction was not simply anger. It was a combination of frustration, disbelief, and a profound sense of personal affront. The loss of perceived influence struck at the core of her self-identity. At the same time, Meghan's tantrum underscores a critical tension in modern royalty. The collision of traditional authority with contemporary expectations of personal expression. Royals are expected to maintain discipline, to uphold centuries of protocol, and to operate within tightly defined roles. Meghan, by contrast, approached her position with a modern mindset, emphasizing individuality, media influence, and public perception. The clash between these two approaches was not merely emotional, it was institutional. It illuminated the broader challenge the monarchy faces in accommodating members who operate in the global media spotlight while maintaining adherence to centuries-old norms. Insiders also report that Meghan's tantrum had a ripple effect on palace operations. Staff were placed in difficult positions, balancing loyalty to the crown with sensitivity to Meghan's emotional state. Private meetings were convened, communications were carefully managed, and protocols were reinforced to prevent further escalation. The HRH ultimatum had not only provoked a personal reaction, but had also tested the resilience of the palace as an institution, highlighting the delicate interplay between authority, discretion, and human emotion. Interestingly, the tantrum itself became a turning point. While it represented a breach of composure, it also clarified William's strategy. By allowing Meghan to express her frustration while maintaining firm boundaries, he signaled that emotional reactions could not alter institutional rules. Titles, privileges, and responsibilities were not negotiable, regardless of public sentiment or private emotional appeals. This approach, according to palace insiders, was designed to assert authority without escalating conflict unnecessarily, a delicate balance between firmness and diplomacy. Even as Meghan's emotions subsided, the implications of the tantrum continued to unfold. Advisors recognized that the episode had made the limits of her power unmistakable. For Meghan, it was a stark reminder that her public persona, while influential, did not grant her the authority to bypass centuries of protocol. And for the palace, it reinforced the importance of clearly defining the boundaries between personal ambition and institutional duty. Yet the story does not end here. While the tantrum highlighted the tension between public image and private reaction, it also set the stage for the next phase of the conflict, a calculated move by William to formally strip Meghan of privileges, enforce compliance, and reassert the authority of the monarchy. The emotional outburst, dramatic as it was, had only underscored the necessity of decisive action. As the palace prepared for the next steps, Meghan faced a choice that would define her future. Acquiesce to the rules, risking the erosion of her personal narrative, or resist, challenging both William and centuries of royal tradition. The world, as always, would be watching, and the stakes had never been higher. History has always remembered moments when authority is exercised decisively, when the rules of an institution are enforced with unflinching clarity. For the British monarchy, that moment arrived with Meghan Markle. Following her private tantrum and the HRH ultimatum, Prince William faced a choice: enforce the rules strictly and risk public controversy, or allow precedent to be broken, undermining centuries of protocol. The decision he made was bold, historic, and unprecedented. He moved to strip Meghan Markle of her royal titles and privileges, a step that would send shockwaves through the palace, the media, and the world. The decision was not impulsive. Months of preparation, consultation, and strategic planning preceded it. William, along with senior advisors and legal experts, weighed every possible outcome. They considered the optics, the public backlash, and the potential ramifications for royal authority. They analyzed historical precedents, examining past instances of royals losing titles or privileges, and noted how those events were received by the public and by royal insiders. It was clear, inaction was not an option. The institution could not tolerate ambiguity, especially with someone of Meghan's global profile. When the decision was finally made, it was executed with precision. Meghan was formally notified that her HRH title, along with all associated privileges, would be withdrawn. Privileges that many might take for granted: access to royal residences, ceremonial roles, security support, and participation in official royal engagements, would no longer be hers. According to insiders, the notification was deliberate and measured, designed to be clear and irrefutable. There was no ambiguity, no room for negotiation. This was the enforcement of centuries of protocol, a reminder that titles are earned through adherence to duty, not asserted through public presence or media influence. The palace described the step as necessary to preserve the monarchy's integrity. Every title carries weight. Every privilege signifies responsibility. Allowing exceptions would not only undermine the rules, but also invite a precedent where influence could be leveraged over authority, where ambition could override institutional order. For William, enforcing this step was about more than personal conflict. It was about protecting the foundation of the monarchy itself. Meghan's reaction to the formal stripping of her titles, according to palace insiders, was intense. Her private frustration, already heightened during the HRH ultimatum, exploded into a mixture of disbelief, anger, and urgency. She reportedly demanded explanations, questioned the fairness of the decision, and attempted to appeal through intermediaries. Yet William and his team remained resolute. Titles are privileges tied to adherence to rules. Emotional reactions cannot alter protocol. For Meghan, this marked a historic shift. Her identity as a royal, her influence, and her platform were now officially curtailed. This step also had wider implications for the family and the monarchy. Advisors anticipated global media scrutiny, social media backlash, and debates over the fairness of the decision. Supporters of Meghan painted it as a harsh, unprecedented move. Traditionalists hailed it as a necessary enforcement of protocol. The palace recognized that the story would dominate headlines, sparking conversations about power, gender, media influence, and the evolving role of royals in modern society. Every statement, every leak, every narrative would be amplified, making the timing and clarity of the action crucial. Importantly, The stripping of titles was not merely symbolic. It was practical. Meghan lost formal avenues of influence within royal institutions. Access to confidential communications, ceremonial roles, and the ability to act on behalf of the monarchy in public functions was removed. Security arrangements were reassessed, and her participation in high-profile engagements was no longer sanctioned by the crown. This was a complete recalibration of her status within the royal hierarchy, a demonstration that privilege is inseparable from responsibility. Palace staff described the atmosphere as tense, yet highly organized. Advisors coordinated every step to ensure a smooth execution, minimizing potential leaks while maintaining the integrity of the decision. Internal communications emphasized discretion, professionalism, and adherence to protocol. For William, the bold step was both a protective measure and a declaration of authority. The monarchy operates on rules, and deviations, even by the most high-profile members, cannot be tolerated. Yet, the human element was undeniable. Meghan's personal frustration, the strain on family relationships, and the emotional stakes for both sides highlighted a reality often hidden from the public. Royal authority is not exercised in isolation. Every decision has consequences, both personal and institutional. For Meghan, the loss of titles meant a confrontation with the limits of influence, the fragility of privilege, and the reality of accountability. For William, it was a test of leadership, discipline, and the ability to enforce rules without damaging the monarchy's public image. The action also sparked whispers among other royals and advisors. Some praised William's decisiveness, noting that such enforcement was necessary to maintain order. Others worried about potential backlash, suggesting that Meghan's global influence could turn public opinion against the monarchy. The tension between maintaining tradition and responding to modern scrutiny became the defining challenge of this moment. Every decision had to balance authority, optics, and long-term stability. The bold step also sent a message far beyond the palace walls. Royals, both within and outside the UK, understood the significance. Protocol is non-negotiable. Privileges are inseparable from responsibility. Authority cannot be undermined by personal ambition, media strategy, or public perception. In one decisive action, William had clarified the rules for everyone, setting a precedent that would resonate for generations. And yet, despite the clarity of the step, the story was far from over. Meghan's response, both public and private, would continue to unfold. Allies and critics alike monitored her every move, analyzing statements, appearances, and subtle gestures. The palace itself prepared for a period of intense scrutiny, aware that the fallout from this bold action could be immediate, prolonged, and globally amplified. What makes this moment historic is not simply the stripping of titles. It's what it reveals about power, responsibility, and the limits of influence. Meghan Markle, one of the most high-profile figures in the world, had been formally curtailed in her royal authority. The HRH title, once a symbol of prestige, was now gone. Privileges that seemed inherent to her position had been removed. And for the monarchy, this bold step reinforced a fundamental truth. In this institution, tradition, duty, and protocol reigned supreme. The moment Prince William enforced the removal of Meghan Markle's HRH title, the world ignited. Within minutes, international media outlets were reporting, analyzing, and speculating on one of the most dramatic royal moves in recent memory. Social media platforms exploded with reactions, opinions, and outrage from every corner of the globe. What had been a private palace decision now became a worldwide spectacle, magnified by 24-hour news cycles and the relentless pace of online discourse. For the palace, the media storm was expected, but its intensity was unprecedented. Every detail, from the wording of the official statement to the timing of public disclosure, was scrutinized. Analysts pored over photos of Meghan's recent appearances, dissecting facial expressions, posture, and subtle gestures for clues about her response. Headlines ranged from sympathetic portrayals of Meghan as a wronged figure to narratives praising William's decisive action as essential to preserving the monarchy's integrity. In the span of hours, the story had evolved from an internal palace matter to a global conversation about power, privilege, and protocol. The diversity of reactions was staggering. In the United Kingdom, Tabloids framed the decision as a historic assertion of royal authority, with pundits highlighting the importance of maintaining discipline within the monarchy. In contrast, many international outlets emphasized Meghan's public influence, portraying her as a figure caught between personal ambition and institutional restriction. Social media amplified these narratives, creating a virtual tug-of-war between supporters of Meghan and defenders of the crown. Hashtags soared, trending topics dominated feeds, and even casual observers felt compelled to weigh in on the unfolding drama. Public reaction was further fueled by Meghan's previous high-profile media appearances. Every past interview, every statement about her experiences within the royal family, and every portrayal of her charitable work suddenly became context for understanding the removal of her title. Commentators revisited interviews where she referenced HRH, analyzing them as evidence of the behavior William had sought to correct. This retrospective scrutiny intensified the narrative. What may have seemed innocuous at the time was now framed as part of a larger pattern of defiance, bolstering the palace's justification for decisive action. The global reaction was not limited to print and digital media. Television networks ran continuous coverage, blending live reporting with expert analysis. Royal correspondents dissected the decision in minute detail, discussing the history.